right, so this is the introduction on segregation and the civil rights movement. I'm sure you're thinking we spent a lot of time on the civil rights movement, so as a result, we will focus on the tension between the federal and state government. Before we begin, we do need to start with some little understanding of race and these charts. So hopefully you completed the task here using this particular sheet and you have some understanding of these particular charts, but I'll address some of them in this screencast here. Before we begin, I want you to understand that there's only one race. It's the human race. Everything else, Black, Caucasian, Muslim, Puerto Rican, all of this stuff is made up. It's a social construct, which means that society has created that particular belief system. Think about race more along the lines of biology, which is kind of difficult to understand, but it kind of makes sense. Let's think about this task, and I use this in race, class, gender. Fill in the blank in your head. All whites are blank. All blacks are blank. All Asians are blank. All Puerto Ricans are blank. Notice how the last one, Puerto Rican, well, how could that even be a race? That just could mean, I'm from Puerto Rico. What does that have to do with race? But the society does buy into it as having some sort of legitimate biological basis. Also, think about this. What if we took that same fill-in-the-blank questionnaire and we gave it to people in, I don't know, any country in Africa? We gave it to, people in Saudi Arabia. Their responses would be different because it would be based on that place's understanding of race. So my point here is that race is flawed, but it does mean something. And for example, if we're looking at the idea of race as a color, you want to look up this guy Blumenbach. The idea with regard to race as a white, black, red. That idea comes from him. It is his socially constructed concept of race. This one right here is interesting here, John Langton. This guy, this one's really messed up. I mean, when we look at this term here, which is offensive, the Mongoloid, he's referring to people of Asia. He's saying that they are part of the Mongoloid race due to their facial disfiguring features. And he does something pretty interesting. He looks at people primarily from China, Japan, Korea, and he's looking at their facial features, primarily the eyes, and he makes a pretty obvious conclusion regarding their eyes and people with Down syndrome. This guy did a lot of research in the study of Down syndrome, and I just find that fascinating that something so basic has some sort of credibility in the 1800s, which is another thing to point out, that these individuals coming up with these concepts of race there in the 1800s seems to be a lot of work. So in this one, this is just some of his research here. There's reason to dread the result of the fusion and transfusion of the Chinese, Mongolian, or yellow race. So he's saying that's the yellow race. So he's buying into Blumenbach's theory of race as a color. It's a depraved and a debased blood. Not anything too positive. Mongolian or yellow race is radically different from the European or white race, which is interesting. Also to point out here, like if you're a Caucasian, that means you're from the Caucasus area. So if you've ever used that term, say, hey, you're a Caucasian or I'm Caucasian, it might be the wrong descriptive label. My point here is that it's all made up and just something to think about. Remember, there's only one race, the human race. The problem is when we look at society and you start to build these systems, they could have some pretty negative outcomes. So this is the vicious cycle chart here, and if you watch the video Sound and Fury, I'm trying to put deaf Americans into this vicious cycle. And we've looked at this, I think, at some point. You have prejudice and discrimination that leads to a social disadvantage and a confirmation among the targeted group. So how does that work? Well, I like to think of prejudice and discrimination as just individual choices and belief systems, whereas these social disadvantages, these are more institutionalized, like they could be schools, big institutions, and things like that. As a result, the victim group, they start to have a belief in inferiority. So if we look at this model here, They use the example that deaf people are dumb. That was said in the documentary Sound and Fury. So as a result of that, okay, so the individual has that particular belief system. So you're social disadvantaged. Well, how's that going to play out in schools? Well, the deaf schools are inferior. They said that they can't read beyond the fourth grade level. As a result, there might be a belief in inferiority among the victim group. That then almost acts as evidence that leads to more prejudice and discrimination, and the cycle just repeats. And keep in mind, you can put numerous minority groups into this particular category, and you possibly can even put majority groups into that. So here I just did this with segregation. You have prejudice and discrimination. If we're looking at the 1800s and 1900s, probably a very similar argument to be made that, the African American population, these individuals do not have any education. As a result, you see some social disadvantages. Think about black and white schools. There are argument to be made that white schools were funded heavily in comparison to black schools. Well, that is a social disadvantage, and that leads to a belief in inferiority. How do we know that? Well, if you're unfamiliar with this particular picture here, this is how Brown versus Board of Ed, they prove that separate but equal is not. They basically get a series of children and they show them these dolls. And in this situation here, you might ask the kid a question like, which doll's good, which doll's bad, which doll do you want to be, which doll do you not want to be? And what they found was at such an early age, black children, they did not associate anything positive with this child here, this baby. Everything that was good was with this one. So they argue that at such an early age, that society had altered their understanding of themselves. And that's what was used to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So this was a section that you were, asked to think about. What are you? You wanted you to watch Sound and Fury, and then think about these questions. Are you going to get the implant? So I would say if you chose, yeah, I'm going to get my kid the implant, then you are just set you up, because I would say you were part of the hearing group, which makes you the majority, and you are saying that deaf culture pretty much is a culture that is inferior. And I was just trying to set you up there. Like if you're saying, yeah, I'm going to get my kid the implant, what are you then saying? You're saying that that kid, the way he was born, is some sort of condition that is going to prevent him from being successful, whatever that means. Now, I would challenge that and I would say, well, it really is not the individual's choice. It is the social disadvantages that are really creating the conditions that are, holding that individual back. So it's not necessarily the deaf kid's fault. It's not necessarily this African American's fault in the 50s. It's a result of the social disadvantages that are creating this particular belief in inferiority. So if you watch the documentary and you're like, yeah, I'm going to get my kid the implant, that's because you're part of the hearing majority. You just think you are better than the deaf culture, than deaf people. You are an elitist, is what I would say. Yeah, I'm just messing with you. But yeah, I would probably be in your face right now if we were in class saying you're an elitist. You think you're better. I don't even want to hear it. And I really would be getting into character. Think about the year 1953, your child being born gay. What would you do? And that's, if you say, yeah, I'm going to get this pill and I'm going to make the child a heterosexual, that doesn't make you homophobic. It's just, I really want you to think about this question here is, what is going to create less problems? You have to understand that, people of the majority group, they're going to pick on these individuals. And, if you're making your decision, hopefully it's not because you're saying you're homophobic, but it's really about looking at the best interests of the child with regard to how they possibly are going to be treated by the majority. So I threw this one in here about being black. What about that one? You're a Muslim family. This was about 2 years ago. I think at Woodbridge High School. Took a snapshot, and that was just posted. What about these individuals here? Looking at the loss of their brother after 9/11. If you're a Muslim family after 9/11, what are you going to do? You're going to change up. It's interesting to point out that these individuals right here, they're Sikhs, and they were just accused by some ignorant American that they kind of look a certain way, and based on that, they're somehow linked to Al Qaeda. There's a documentary on this one. I don't quite remember the name of it. PBS put it out. I have to think about that one. What about this one? You know, the girl who has this name here, and the teacher is struggling to pronounce it on day one, and say, "Yeah, just call me Terry, call me Janet." This individual has altered and has assimilated by changing her name in that scenario. So segregation laws, I know that we've studied segregation laws, and you're probably thinking, well, segregation laws, we know about them. But I want you to really think about these segregation laws. What I want you to do is think about the complexity in enforcing these segregation laws and creating them. Nurses, buses, railroads, restaurants, parks, wine, beer. Like, you have to really think about every category. And this is where we're starting to transition into the tension between the state and federal government. So what I want you to do is, I'm going to go to the next slide. I want you to pause it. Let's see what we've got. These section. Where are my laws? Right here. I want you to pause it and just pick one law that for some reason interests you. I'm going to switch to the next slide, and I want you to do the same thing. Pause it and identify a law that for some reason interests you. And when I say interest, I mean just for some reason. Do the same on this one. And that's kind of our approach here, where we're going to be looking at segregation through the lens of, tension between the federal and the state government. But I did want to start off with some understanding of race and the minority and majority. Like, they have a law for the blind. So this is a social disadvantage, that's going to create a belief in inferiority. They're going to maintain a separate building for the mission, care, instruction, support of blind persons in Louisiana. So this is the state of Louisiana saying, yes, we are going to keep our blind people separate. Circus tickets. This one's interesting. I wonder where the Tiger King would fit into this one. What I like about this law, less than 25 feet apart. I can't understand why they would want to have these tickets being sold 25 feet. So here's the circus, and you're selling these tickets. So, they have to be separate, 25 feet. At what point did the lawyers, how do they come up with that number 25? 20 feet, not enough. I need to be far away. I just can't understand. Just think about the extreme measures that places are going to have to go through in order to comply with some of this state legislation. 25 feet apart. Don't keep me next to that individual. Intermarriage. This one's interesting here. Okay, so intermarriage. All marriage between a white person and a Negro, or white person of Negro descent, of fourth generation inclusive. Wow, I don't even know what that means. Fourth generation inclusive, but they put that in there. They are forever prohibited. Can't get married. So the state of Florida passes this. And I can only imagine that people decided, well, let's just live together. We can't get married. There's a law against it, but we can live together. So somewhere in here, this white area section, you have the intermarriage, and people start living together, which forces the state of Florida to say, you know what, this law right here did not work. Let's pass a cohabitation law. Any Negro man and white woman, or any white man, Negro woman, who are not married to each other, who shall habitually live in and occupy in the nighttime the same room. They passed a law because people found a loophole somewhere here against this law. Cohabitation. That's pretty much the approach here, that the state government is doing something, and then you have to figure out a way around the law. Restaurants. All persons licensed to conduct the restaurant shall serve either white exclusively or colored people exclusively, and shall not sell to the two races within the same room, or serve two races anywhere under the same license. Georgia. Interesting. Shall be unlawful to conduct a restaurant or other place for the serving of food in the city at which white and colored people are served in the same room, unless such white and colored persons are effectually separated by a solid partition. And so now, if I'm a restaurant owner, I have to have a solid partition. Think about that. I have to build a wall. So the state of Alabama is telling me build a wall. Build a wall because, we can't have these two races together. So build the wall. How high do I have to build this wall? Well, you have to have a distance of 7 feet or higher. Can I use glass? Can I use wood? Well, can I use marble? What am I going to use? All these things are complicated, but they are going through some pretty extreme measures in Alabama to make sure that you keep the races separate. Now, I don't necessarily know that you've ever thought of segregation like that. Here's what I want you to do on this one. So we have the law. I want you to take your screen and comply with the law. This is your restaurant. I want you to figure out how are you going to comply with the law. The law wants you to have that partition up. So think about it. How would you comply with the law? Let's say you build your wall this way, and here, and here, and here, and here. Let's just say each foot of wall cost you $100 to build. And then did you comply with segregation, this particular law? So I want you thinking about that. And that's going to be our focus for next class. So what I want you to do for the end here is to simply just, if you're using a computer screen, a laptop, I don't know if you're on your phone, but if you are on a screen, just take a piece of paper, put it over here, and just draw your line. What would your wall look like? And did you actually comply with this legislation? Good luck.